All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the HOSR 50 Years, 50 Stories Story Hour. My name is Jen Wesson. I'm the Executive Director of the Head of the Schuylkill Regatta, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and the Committee 50, we welcome you to our 5th Story Hour of 2023, a year in which we are focusing on the historic events that allowed for the origins and shaping of Boathouse Row, telling the story through the lens of existing clubs and organizations, as well as through parallel developments in other cities. Tonight's story hour will demonstrate the growth of rowing in sister cities, Philadelphia and Boston. We have with us Bill Miller of Union Boat Club and Claudia Siegel and John Basinski of University Barge Club to present the club's parallel histories and the camaraderie they've been sharing since 1946. Let me tell you a little bit about our speakers this evening. Bill Miller is a 50-year member of Union Boat Club. He raced for them internationally under that Union flag in 1969, 71, and 92. UBC, he was also a Union Boat Club boathouse resident from 1971 to 1983, which provides a very unique perspective into the life of a boat club. Claudia Siegel has been a member of University Barge Club for 30 years. In 1993, she moved to Philly from Texas, where she was president of the Austin Rowing Club. She served as UBC's Schuylkill Navy delegate, UBC treasurer, and is now chair of the Coxswain Committee. John Basinski joins University Barge Club in 1974, and he served as president from 1999 to 2003.
Right now, I'm trying to get in.
He has done all of the cooking as well, so you hear more about that as we go.
No.
I'm gonna allow some people in here as I'm talking. Okay. So we want the stellar lineup to do most of the talking tonight. I don't want to take too much time with introductions. If you want to learn more about the genesis of these story hours, I invite you to watch some of our past story hours or visit our webpage on the HOSR website. But just a couple of things, housekeeping items to help with our sound and flow. Even though the Zoom format can be tricky with a large group, we continue to use this because we feel it's really important to see one another, your reactions, your laughter, your smiles. And the storytellers are not only sharing with us, but we're sharing with them, the recognition and appreciation for their contributions to our sport and their successes in our community. So I've muted everyone to eliminate any background noise. You have the ability to unmute at any point in time, but please be reminded that if you have any background noise, it's going to keep people from being able to hear the speaker. So just be cognizant of that. Be sure to put your screen on gallery view. So if you're only seeing me right now, way too close up, you're in speaker view. You need to scroll over to the top right-hand part of the screen and you can see options, which you can switch to gallery and then see lots of faces at once. I encourage you to keep your chat room visible off to the side and use that chat room to add comments to the stories the speakers are sharing or ask questions. In addition, I just wanted everyone to be aware that we are recording this session, so it'll be available for all those that are unable to join us tonight and for you to share with other members of your clubs. So as for the format, we'll likely run to about 8:15 tonight because we have a lot to cover. I'm going to turn it over to one of our facilitators and fellow 50 committee members, Christopher Doyle, to introduce and set the stage for our discussion tonight. You can pose questions anytime in the chat room, but we will reserve the last 15 minutes of the night for the audience to kind of join in, verbally ask questions, or share stories. So you can always use that emoji, hand emoji, or raise your hand, or just unmute yourself. So Christopher, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if everybody else wants to start throwing in the chat room what club they're with, or just how you came to this story hour, you can enter that in the chat room. I'm going to throw on my University Barge Club hat, and I'm going to turn it over to Christopher.
Thank you, Jen. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 16th story hour on Zoom. My name's Chris Doyle. I'm the historian at the Pennsylvania Barge Club, and I've been privileged to be a member of the 50 Stories team since May of 22. My fellow team members have asked me to make a couple of introductory remarks on how this episode fits in overall with our our overall themes and mission. And first of all, those of you who have been following us regularly may have noticed that we've broadened our coverage well beyond the confines of Philadelphia rowing. This episode follows that path by including a discussion of the longstanding partnership between University Barge Club in Philly with Union Boat Club in Boston. And Bill Miller, who is an extremely popular historian of American rowing, will lead a discussion about the development of Union Boat Club specifically and Boston rowing in general, which roughly parallels many of the developments in Philadelphia and Fairmount Park. And this underscores how geography and environment influences the development of rowing-friendly venues and the public works infrastructure projects that create those venues. We are also privileged to count Bill as a member of our steering committee, and we're fortunate to receive his advice and guidance on many issues that inform our mission. Members of our steering committee range from New England to Seattle, so their input covers very broad territory. The second aspect of these ongoing themes is club culture. And Claudia and John are going to focus on the history of the University Barge Club, and they'll underscore that rowing clubs are much more than boats and racing. Each has a unique culture shaped by the values and principles that guide the members. And there are lots of rituals and ceremonies that are unique to every club that unify the members in a cohesive way. Now, as outsiders, we may find some of these things to be eccentric, but their purpose is to instill lasting bonds and unity, which is really essential for clubs to thrive over hundreds of years. And our May 23rd episode about Bachelor's Barge Club was entitled Rituals and Racing. And this private cultural dimension of club life was presented in a fascinating way by our own Henry Hopführer, and our steering committee member from Detroit Boat Club, Stephen Malboof, also echoed this in his discussion of the Detroit Boat Club in March. So thank you all, and please take it away, Bill and Claudia and John.
Okay. Well, we are to begin with University Barge Club in Philadelphia. Just a little bit of information about us. We're 169 years old at this writing. There you go. We're 169 years old at this writing, and we're the only surviving member of the original clubs that comprise the Siegel Navy. We are principally a master's sculling club. Our house holds a fleet consisting of singles, doubles, quads, 2 8s, and 1 octuple, along with about 25 private boats, for a total of about 76 club seats. We have something over 234 members, 142 of whom classify themselves as active rowers, and about 100 of those row 100 miles or more per year. Next slide, please. We, UBC, that is, like all of the boat clubs along Boathouse Row, get our start when the Fairmount Waterworks is built. The Philadelphia City Council was very concerned about the quality of the water that the city had to draw on. And so in order to facilitate the provision of water to the city, a dam is built across the Siegel that creates, in essence, a very placid rowing environment above the dam. Here's an etching that shows the dam, the waterworks. And if you go to the next slide, you can see something that perhaps sets the scenario out a little better. You could see the around the curve, the boathouses are being erected. You see ferries down here. The waterworks is the large building there in the center, and the water is being pumped up to a reservoir on a hill, and it then flows down into the city. That where the reservoir is in this 1876 photo is now the site of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Next slide. UBC is founded in 1854 by UPenn grads. They purchased a 4-oared barge called the Hesperus from Bachelor's for $100. They build a 1-story boathouse with Naiad Boat Club. This boathouse was located about 100 yards downriver from where we are now, about where Fairmount Rowing Association is now. Next slide. In order to build culture, as Chris was talking about, the boat clubs often had uniforms. And since the original members, the original bargees apparently trained with some of the fire companies in Philadelphia, they chose as their initial uniform this red fireman's shirt, which is pretty nifty. And they wore it with black leather trousers. Next slide. Some people felt this wasn't elaborate enough or formal enough. So they then designed another uniform that's all white, and you wore it with a big black belt buckle that had UBC inscribed on it. Unfortunately, this uniform was apparently not particularly appropriate or worthy. A group of bargees rode up to Manayunk to get some sausages and other provisions. People mocked them, threw things at them, including lumps of coal, and the bargees had to return shamefaced to what was then Boathouse Row, and they went back to their red shirts that were based on the firemen's outfits. Next slide. In the 1850s, with this more placid rowing environment, a lot of rowing clubs sprang up. The Siegel Navy was formed in 1858. But with the advent of the Civil War, a lot of bargees go off to fight, and UBC rents out that small one-story house, and they move down to the Skaters Club, which is today PGRC. And UBC remains at PGRC, or pardon me, then at the Skaters Club until 1871, when it gets its own boathouse. Next slide. And the development of that boathouse is pretty interesting, because what starts to happen in the 1860s is that the city starts to acquire land to build a park around the river to ensure the purity of the water supply. But they go a little too slowly for the park advocates in Philadelphia. The park advocates then go to the state legislature and insist on the creation of a more powerful body that will act more quickly to create a park. So you get the creation by the Philadelphia General Assembly of the Fairmount Park Commission in 1868. And the Park Commission then starts acquiring land on both sides of the river. And by the year 1900, you have a 3,000 acre park developed in Philadelphia. And it's the park is created as open public ground for the preservation of Schuylkill water and of the health and enjoyment of the people forever. Next slide, please. Once the park commissioners start to take an interest in the park itself, they also take an interest in what structures are in the park, and they decide they don't like the brick boathouses that many of the rowing clubs have erected. And so in 1869, they send a letter to the boat clubs along with a resolution ordering the removal of the brick boathouses. On or before the first day of August next, boat clubs may obtain permission to erect new buildings upon such sites and architectural designs as shall be approved by the Committee on Plans and Improvements. And we have the original letter and the original resolution, and quite frankly, when you first read them, they're pretty terrifying. Next slide. So UBC gets together with the Philadelphia Barge Club, and together they build a boathouse in 1871. And this is a photo of the original house. Philadelphia Barge Club occupies the upriver part of the house, and University occupies the downriver part of the house. Next slide. You can see that the surroundings are pretty primitive. This is 1875, 4 years after the initial building of the house. It's pretty rough terrain. If you, next slide, please. If you're on the west side of the river in the 1870s, this is what our part of Boathouse Row looks like at that time. Over to the left, you'll see the Vesper Malta Boathouse, and then UBC PBC Boathouse right next to it. And look at all the woodland back there. Next slide. The river at this time is still a lot of mixed boat traffic. It's not just people rowing barges and such. You have excursion boats, you have ferry boats. There were lots of obstacles. We have some accounts from bargees rowing at this time about how really rough it was and how careful you had to be. Next slide. This is Lower Boathouse Row in 1873. This is taken below the dam. The photograph is taken looking upriver. There's over to the left is the Vesper Malta Boathouse, then some junk boathouses that were apparently later torn down, then UBC and little bachelors. Next slide. In 1893, UBC and PBC expand the boathouse by putting new boat bays on the upriver side and on the downriver side, and with some additions on top as well. But everything in the house is devoted to boats. The bottom part of the house was used for storing the boats, and the upper part of the house, the second story, was used for locker rooms. There's really no social space. Next slide. And because there's no social space, and yet the club keeps wanting to have social functions, UBC contracts with the park for renting a house called the Lilacs, which is a beautiful structure. And it was possible to row from the UBC PBC boathouse up to the Lilacs and have a great old time. Next slide, please. This shows you the location of the Lilacs. For anybody who's acquainted with our river, it's just above the Strawberry Mansion Bridge. And as John, I think, said something earlier, now it's obstructed by the freeway. But
I-76.
Yeah, by 76. But initially it was quite accessible from the river. Next slide. In fact, at the 50th anniversary of the club, there is a big gathering at the Lilacs in 1904. You can see people waiting on the bank, and you can see people coming up for the celebration in 6-oared ladies' barges with the rower in one seat, and next to the rower sat a lady to be conveyed upward. Next slide. To be conveyed upward to the Lilacs. This is a wonderful sketch done by Rick Hershoff, a former member. He also did the sketch of the original bargee in the white uniform. This is what those 6-oared barges looked like. It appears that at one time we had about 8 of these, I think. They were made by a boat maker named William Glass in 1889. And we also had William Glass at that time make a double ladies' boat and a single ladies' boat. Next slide. Our 6-oared barges have gone the way of all things, but we have retained the double and the single. And here's a picture of the ladies' boat at the 1975 Head of the Schuylkill Regatta. Next slide. Here's the double and the single being rowed at our 125th club anniversary in 1979. Next slide. And here are 2 inebriated bargees in the double ladies' boat. Behind them, you see the single ladies' boat with Bruce Lalonde and his wife, and the 2 inebriated bargees in the double ladies' boat are Charlie Meredith and Frances Ballard, 2 of our wonderful longtime members. Next slide. These are the ladies' boats today. We trotted them out a couple of weeks ago to test seaworthiness. The single is in pretty good shape. It took on very little water. The double, on the other hand, definitely requires some work, which we hope we will be getting to. Next slide. So if you look at UBC by the decades, the decade from 1900 to 1910, we read about a lot of annual regattas, club regattas with Philadelphia Barge Club, and also sometimes with Malta. There's lots of lilac socializing. We celebrate UBC's 50th anniversary. The decade from 1910 to 1920, the key event here is the First World War. About 75% of our active membership enlists in the American Expeditionary Force, and rowing really ceases until about 1919. When folks come back from the First World War, it's the Roaring 20s. There's much more socializing than rowing, and lots of utilization of the lilacs. In 1929, of course, there's the stock market crash and then the Depression. And unfortunately, the Depression causes Philadelphia Barge Club to go under. It disbands, it donates its part of the house and equipment to UBC, and a lot of the remaining active members join UBC. The next decade, World War II is a major factor. A lot of bargees enlist in the armed forces. We have plaques on our stairway walls commemorating the bargees who were lost in both of the world wars. However, there's a bright spot, and that's the first UBC Interclub Regatta in 1946. The 1950s is a bit of a doldrums for UBC. It's a less active period because when the men come back from the war, they really want to settle down. A lot of them get married. Rowing is not a big priority. We nonetheless celebrate the 100th anniversary in 1954, but for financial reasons and because of the construction of the highway, we make a 1955 decision to vacate the lilacs. And what we do is to create a lilacs room out of the former Philadelphia Barge Club locker room. This is a period when leadership really counted. Bill Hollenbach Jr. was our president from 1954 to 1959. I'm sure his name is familiar to many people on this call. He was a superb oarsman and very significant in national rowing. He's the president of USRA from 1978 to 1986. Next slide. This is a photo, thanks to Bill Miller, of the very first UBC Interclub Regatta. Next slide. So how do we characterize the first 100 years of the University Barge Club? Well, I think when the Schuylkill Navy sent us a congratulatory proclamation, they captured it very well. The University Barge Club has, perhaps more than any other club, exemplified that unique form of social activity which consisted of long rows on the river, barge parties, and other amusements directly connected with the water. Not so deeply imbued with the racing spirit, as it were, the men of university learned to enjoy the river for its intrinsic beauty and tranquility. By their faithful adherence to the pleasant and colorful practices of the oarsmen of past generations, and by their emphasis on the old-fashioned ideals of sportsmanship and fair play, the men of university have eminently succeeded in maintaining a positive living contact with the past history of rowing. And one way that UBC did that, next slide, I think, was to bring up through its ranks not just one or two folks in a given family, but in some cases multiple generations within a single family. A great example of this is the Borey family. If you look at the gentleman at the right on the right-hand side of your screen, this is Bobo Borey. He's elected to the club in 1868. Next to him is Charles Lewis Borey, who's elected to the club in 1888 and serves as treasurer from 1894 to 1901. And the gentleman next to him is C. Lewis Borey III, who was elected to the club in 1914 and serves as president from 1941 to 43. And that itty bitty baby is Alfred C. Borey, or Ace, as we all knew him, elected to the club in 1946 and president from 1963 to 1971. So there's some real generational continuity throughout the club's history. Next slide. And Ace really turns out to be quite a pivotal figure in UBC history. He serves for 8 years as president, right? Most people for 2 to 3 years, but Ace goes the gamut for 8 years as president. Under his leadership, membership in the club greatly expands. We get about 60 or so new members. There's clarification of the dues and club structure. We see the first bylaws update in 70 years, if you can imagine. And he steers the club through a discussion with the city and the park on the rights and responsibilities of the both clubs. He also develops a relationship with Chestnut Hill Academy, which is now Springside Chestnut Hill, so that they come and row out of the house and pay rent, which definitely helps with the finances of the club. He's really quite a fantastic figure and an awfully nice gentleman. He's followed by Lyman Perry, who a lot of folks on this call remember. Lyman succeeds Ace. He establishes the head of the Siegel Regatta and the club newsletter. And he does something else very significant. Next slide. He brings in a coxswain and boatman by the name of Bruce Lalonde, who remains with us for 48 years until 2019. Bruce has a tremendous impact on the club. He better organizes the boathouse. He builds all of the boat racks. He improves the fleet astronomically. He establishes a required logbook procedure, which he then oversees. If you do something wrong, Bruce puts a star next to your name, writes out so that everybody can see what you did wrong, and sometimes includes an epithet. Bonehead becomes an integral part of our UBC rowing terminology. So he's you can't say enough about what Bruce does for our club. There are other changes that take place when Lyman steps down as president. The newsletter is turned over to another former president, George Harding, and also to Jeff Walker, who does a number of things around the club. They continue to edit the newsletter until 2001, that is to say for 28 years. And in 2003, Basinski takes over the newsletter, which is now disseminated electronically. Here is a more typical photo of Bruce. Certainly, he's rarely seen in a suit. So that was definitely the exception. And of course, he's telling people what to do, or more likely, what not to do. Next slide. Oh, back. Well, there we go. With the influx of membership in the 60s and 70s, there also comes, unfortunately, some natural tragedies because of dredging, and unnatural, I guess. There's at least one dredging project that comes too close to the shore and destabilizes our boathouse so that we have a couple of walls fall down. That has to be repaired. Then we have in 1977 an ice storm, which completely decimates our dock and float. But we also have, thank goodness, a wonderfully talented membership. And so you see the disaster in the lower slide, the lower picture, that's John Basinski and Bruce Lalonde putting together a dock, along with a lot of other people who contribute to this project. And I'm sorry, I can't name them all, but that talent and transformation and the volunteer spirit that motivates recovery from disasters like this were absolutely essential to the club's well-being. And next slide. What you saw before was, of course, the disaster, but here you see the transformation. This is the after effect. John told me that the only problem with this wonderful construction was that the ladies' heels got caught in the holes on the dock. Is that right, John?
Yeah. Yeah, we had to redeck it with narrower spacing.
Ah, well, you should have tried it out with high heels before you finalized everything. Right?
I didn't want people to see me.
Okay. In the 1980s, our membership continues to expand. We see a lot more miles rowed, a lot more member participation, but this also presents the club with challenges. How do we preserve the people aspect of the club, that member feeling and culture? President Mike Hogue from 1983 to 1986 writes a very deeply thought out memo on all of this and produces some recommendations that are definitely to the benefit of the club. Meanwhile, the head of the school is growing very rapidly. In 1987, it sees over 2,500 entries, a tremendous expansion. from the 406 that we had in 1975. We also see a greater attention along the road to structural issues related to the boat clubs and the historical and the realization of the historical importance of the row. And Christopher Blackwall, along with some really great folks from the other boat clubs, they get together and they develop a 501c3 called Historic Boathouse Row that petitions for National Historic Landmark designation, which we then get. Christopher then becomes president of the club, inheriting all of these challenges that UBC and the row is facing. And he names a long-range planning committee under his vice president, who will chair this long-range planning committee, Al During. Next slide. Al During's long-range planning committee comes forward with a recommendation that women be admitted to the club. An announcement made in one of the 1990 newsletters. The vast majority of the male members of the club are in favor, some were opposed, but they nonetheless accept the executive committee's decision. And Ann Cutler and Ann Spaeth were the first two women admitted. Of course, the admission of women requires some changes in the building itself. And Jeff Walker, our newsletter editor, who is also an architect, designs the very first women's locker room for the club, which is then enlarged in 2012 with the help of Kelly Ennis. Also in the 1990s, we see continued inquiries and interest by the city and Fairmount Park in greater diversity among the rowing clubs. UBC builds a relationship with the Fairmount Rowing Program, which is open to all city youth. And another significant development during the 90s is we have a treasurer by the name of Mitch Budman, who I think is on this call. He makes some wise financial decisions to put the club on stronger financial footing. This cartoon signifying advancement into the 90s and into 2000 is done by Signe Wilkinson, one of our wonderful members. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist. And as you can see, this is UBC advancing. Give me your tired, you're middle-aged, you're out of shape yuppies yearning to be fit. Next slide. Just some quick pics. Mike Hogue, quick pics of UBC presidents in times of change. Mike Hogue on the left, Christopher Blackwall center, and Al During on the right. Next slide. Bill Vanderlyn comes to the presidency in 1993 after Al During, and he's a very well-tempered Dutchman. He lets the dust settle after some significant changes. And in fact, it's so peaceful in the club that nobody notices that his presidency should have expired in 1997. He was an incredible senior masters rower with a tremendous sense of humor and a great rival and friend of Stuyvesant Pell, who I'm sure a lot of people on this call will remember. We also see more in the 1990s, more bargees competing in regattas, but the club's emphasis on fellowship and civility continues. Next slide. Our presidents for the 2000s are John Basinski, who is on this call, and Mitch Budman. John was involved in every single major construction project for the club from the time of his membership. And when he retires from the presidency, he inspires the creation of a separate 501c3, the 1871 Foundation, that will enable the club to accept tax-deductible donations for building maintenance and renovations. Mitch, as I've said, really helps to put the club on a much more solid financial footing, and together, assisted by, again, multiple bargees, because it takes a village, they lead an effort to renovate the building and rebuild the balcony in 1999. And meanwhile, the head of the Schuylkill Regatta has grown so big that it becomes its own separate 501c3. And one of our former presidents, Christopher Blackwall, heads it up. Again, it really does take a village to make things work. Next slide. I think you can sort of assess what of the path of UBC during these years, trying to incorporate and prolong traditions, but at the same time, dealing with present issues and looking to challenges for the future. But one of the great traditions that arises in 1976 and has continued until 2000 is a wonderful gathering that we had at Langshaw's, hosted by Robert C. Lee and his wonderful wife, Nancy. Bo Lee, as he was called, they really go all out. And we have a little regatta, UBC Club Regatta at Langshaw's on the Wye River in Maryland from about 1976 until 2000. When the balcony is built in 1999, it's dedicated to Bo Lee. Next slide. Another tradition that is continued is, of course, UBC. This is a photo courtesy of Bill of the 1996 50th anniversary. And our newsletters cover these interclub regattas from 1976 to 2003. Next slide. Another wonderful tradition that we actually revive is having new members kiss the moose head that hangs in the lilacs room at UBC. We actually knew nothing about this tradition until sometime in the 1990s. Ace Borey was attending an executive committee meeting, and he happened to mention, oh, well, in the old days, we used to make them kiss the moose. Our ears perked up and we said, oh, well, we have to bring that back. And in fact, this last summer when UBC came down to compete in our interclub regatta, some of them got up and kissed the moose. Next slide. Another UBC tradition that we really try to keep is to observe the anniversaries. This is the UBC sesquicentennial celebration in 2004, and you can see those same inebriated bargees cruising around with their ladies in the double ladies boat. Now, you might wonder, what would a founding bargee think if he came back today and looked at the club? Well, Signe took care of that for us with his cartoon. This is Thayer Borey Hoffman Rall III, returning to UBC for a row. He thinks we're a bunch of wimps because the boats are so light and the oars are so light. He thinks he did well because he got a star in the logbook. He doesn't realize that, of course, Bruce intends that to signify that he's done something terribly wrong. And finally, next slide, he totally keels over when he sees a female bargee. So again, we're trying to balance tradition with dealing with the realities of the present and the challenges of the future. We're happy to have lasted 169 years. We hope to continue for another 169. And we want to thank you all for listening to our Reader's Digest version of University Barge Club history. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and John, for putting that together. We're going to turn it over to Bill Miller now. And he's going to share his screen.
Yep, I'm going to first thank you. Well, I still got my screen on, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to share my screen here, so bear with me for a second as I get set up. And I want to move this out of the way. And you don't need to see me. So I had the honor of being the guest speaker at the Union Boat Club annual dinner in May. And I put together this presentation. This follows very closely to what we had in May, although I've tweaked it somewhat to make it more presentable to the broader participants this evening. I'm sorry to say, Claudia, we don't have a moose to kiss at Union, so we'll have to look around and find out how we can substitute that. But anyways, the Union Boat Club was formed in May 26th, 1851. I thought we'd take a look at the years around when the club was founded to see what it was like rowing in Boston in the mid and the late 19th century. And I don't really get into too much after about 1910. The image here shows a crew rowing a similar boat that Union would have rowed in those first few years in the 1850s. I'm going to rely on images to tell the story and follow along by reading my descriptions. So this is Boston that you are familiar with. There was a lot of changes going on in Boston around the time that Union was founded. So I'm going to kind of backtrack and go over and show you what it was like. Let's look at the 1776 map and see how little of Boston's landmass existed. So today and back then, and there was just a little isthmus or a causeway that went out to the town. If you look to the left, you see a massive bay. At the left center margin, you can see just about labeled Charles River. And that's where the BU Bridge is located today. So you can see this massive body of water back there, as well as one down to the lower right. From 1830 to 1880, Boston was undergoing major land reclamation. This affected the waterfront and rowing everywhere, including the Charles and Union Boat Club. Here we have the 1838 map of Boston and the Charles River. The landmass of the city had increased significantly, 76 to 1838. The Charles River was open to the harbor. High tide was higher and low tide was lower than today's constant water level. At low tide, there were many mudflats more towards the Cambridge shore. If you look at the lower red star, it shows South Bay. And South Bay does not exist today. It is filled in, and the Southeast Expressway cuts straight through where the bay once existed. Originally, high tide lapped up against the bottom of Beacon Hill, and Charles Street didn't exist. But fill was brought in to create Charles Street and about another block toward the river. This red star shows the future temporary site of the Union Boat Club boathouse. The first meeting of the members of Union was on May 26th in a room in this building, and at the time it was at the waterfront. This is an 1858 photograph of the back bay on the Charles River facing west. By 1858, a row of residences was being built on the river side of what is now Beacon Street. But the back bay is in the background is still a tidal bay. The red arrow center right points to the white building that Brahman's Baths at the foot of Chestnut Street. Brahman's was bathhouse, and Mr. Brahman built a row of floating boat bays. The 1852 map detail shows Brahman's. The street is labeled Beacon Street and residences just beginning to be built. A stone embankment runs all along the edge of the river. This stone wall is still there today and can be seen along the side of Storrow Drive. All along the wall is where as many as 30,000 spectators would watch races. So the Charles was transformed from a tidal backwater in the early 19th century to a developed waterfront by the 1880s. Rowing in the Charles and Boston was comprised of a number of rowing components, such as club, university, and professional rowing. Some of the clubs were formed usually for recreational purposes. A club would be formed by 6, 8, 10 local men so that they could tour around the harbor, visit harbor islands, head out on an excursion upriver to Brighton, and some of the clubs aspired for racing and maybe earn a few dollars if they won. This photo shows an 8-oared gig cutter out for a spin. This boat could be referred to as a barge or a gig. Going back to the 1838 map, boat clubs were dotted all over the harbor. The South Bay, South Boston, East Boston, Chelsea, Charleston, and Charles River. There were dozens of clubs and mostly comprised of working men such as longshoremen and factory workers, and many were Irish Friends. South Bay was a popular site to row and race. The scullers in this race were described as lumber surveyors. I don't know how they could get lumber surveyors together for a race, but as I mentioned, there is no South Bay now. On the 1855 Colton map, we see the South Bay is partially filled in. that isthmus that was there, that causeway, has grown a great deal. Also, the Back Bay has a development plan superimposed, which is the next Boston land reclamation project. You can see where the mill dam is, and then that bay, which was called Back Bay when it was originally a bay, and now today we call it a back bay, but it's all buildings. Another component adding to the popularity of rowing on the Charles was Harvard boating. In the 1840s, Harvard students wanted to find a diversion from the drudgery of academic life. In 1844, they began forming boat clubs. At first, their interest was recreational, touring, taking excursions, but soon brushes or a brief test of speed snuck into these outings. The boating clubs became identified with their academic class, and their racing took on a bit more seriousness. Here we see the growth of rowing at Harvard from 1849 to 1858. And the first intercollegiate competition, as we all know, took place in 1852 on Lake Quinsigamon in New Hampshire between Harvard and Yale. Eventually, the competitive spirit between the two universities grew, and the annual race became a big public fixture. And this is a photo of the Harvard University Boat Club, aka HUBC. And they're sitting in the front of their first boathouse. It sat on the tidal embankment just below what is today the Weeks Footbridge on the Cambridge shore. Boathouses were merely sheds, sometimes built on the embankment, sometimes on pilings, and sometimes floating. Another major component to the Charles rowing scene was professional racing. Sometimes out-of-town crews raced on the smooth and neutral waters of the Charles River. This is a New York Times article describing a race on the Charles between the James McKay of New York and the Neptune of St. John's, New Brunswick for $800. We need to factor a multiple of about 30 for today's value. So $800 in 1850 is about $24,000 today. It says there were 20,000 spectators lining the embankment stone wall. And I like the last line: considerable money changed hands in private bets. So gambling was the fuel for these big prizes. This race between the Superior Crew from St. John, New Brunswick, and the Pride of Erin from Boston. The race was for $2,000, so the current value would have been $60,000. This is a 12-mile race. Imagine racing in heavy boats with fixed seats. The Maid of Erin eventually quit, and the Superior was far in the lead. Just down the embankment from Union, a few hundred yards near what is now the Museum of Science, was the West End Boat Club. It was a floating boathouse attached to the Craigie's Bridge. The West End Boat Club was the home of many of Boston's professionals: George Faulkner, Patsy Reagan, Frenchie Johnson, George Hosmer, and Fred Plaisted were some of the famous nationally known Boston oarsmen, racing for $500 to $2,000 per race. This 1874 map shows the Charles Basin. You can see that there's no MIT waterfront. The flats went all the way to where railroad tracks cross Massachusetts Ave towards Central Square. The starting line was in front of Union and went up 1.5 miles to a stake in the river close to where the BU Boathouse is now. The course was almost parallel to Beacon Street, slightly angling away. I show the course as a black line. The stake would be turned, shown as a red mark, and return, making the usual distance 3 miles. Sometimes the race was 2 times around, or 6 miles, sometimes 3 times, or 9 miles, and as I previously mentioned, 4 times around, or 12 miles. Racing on the Charles in the early 1850s wasn't well defined. In 1854, New York Times article of a Boston race shows boats with varying configurations racing together: 8 oars, 6 oars, 4 oars, or pair oars. This list shows the article's details. The boats with fewer oars would get a time allotment per oar. Outrigged, in-rigged workboats would all race together. It was a race open to all comers, and it would take another decade for boats classes to be more clearly defined. By 1868, boat type events were scheduled. This was the City Regatta in Charleston. So in the midst of all of this activity, the Union Boat Club was established in 1851. The books, 60 Years of the Union Boat Club and the recent Union Illustrated, have great details about the early club. I'll repeat a few of the details from the books. In 1851, Daniel Webster Rogers called together 11 of his friends with a proposal to organize a boat club for exercise and recreational activities. Mr. Rogers was a follower of his namesake, Daniel Webster, who was a staunch supporter of maintaining the unity of the Republic. So it was in line with Rogers' constitution to name the new club the Union Boat Club. There were other Union boat clubs: Portland, Maine, Worcester, Mass, New York City. So the new Union Boat Club rented a changing room at the Brahmins Baths and purchased their first boat, a 4-oared heavy gig, and named it Union. Would have looked similar to this photo. Their focus the first 3 years was on rowing excursions upriver or touring the harbor or more distant locations, not racing. For the 4th of July regatta in 1854 celebration, the city of Boston sponsored a regatta and appointed Union to manage the races. In 1856, Union purchased their new 6-oared gig and reassigned the name Union to it. In 1857, Union reached a milestone. On June 13th, it won the Beacon Cup at the Beacon Regatta. It was an exciting race. The race was extremely close between the Harvard students in their 8-oared Harvard and Union's new 6-oared Union. In a close finish, Harvard edged Union by 1/2 second. However, an allowance of 15 seconds per oar gave Union a 29.5 second victory and possession of the Beacon Cup. The Beacon Cup is on display in the Chestnut Street Clubhouse. Also shown here is the 1858 sheet music by J.W. Turner, dedicated to the Union Boat Club. And here's a photo of the 1857 UBC oarsmen. Pretty elaborate uniforms. Also in 1857, there was a great race on June 17th between the 6-oared boats of the Volant Club and the Harvard students. Both crews trained intensively for the race. Bellulous Pictorial Weekly shows a wonderful woodblock print of the race with a detailed description of the scene. I'll read a section of the Bellulous text that was printed with the image. The locality is faithfully represented. The houses in the background of the picture are the fine ones recently built on Western Ave. In front to the left are Brahmins Baths and boathouses. From the baths, a line was drawn to the judge's boat to form the starting point and finish for the race. The Volant is represented as having crossed it and the Huron coming up. In the foreground is the judge's boat. Beyond the Volant is one of the boats of the Union Club, and the gentleman pulling the extremely narrow one is Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet, who is very partial to this manly exercise, for which no city in the world has such facilities as Boston. The fine expanse of the Charles River being unimpeded by navigation and the dangers incident to the passage of steamers. Our sketch through the kindness of Mr. Brahman was made from the judge's boat. The text goes on to list the competitors and the race details. It's great to get such a full description of a race on the Charles River at that time. So this detail is the print shows the Union 6 tossing oars and formally saluting the competitors. Harvard was very thankful to Union for allowing them to house their boat the night before the race. And the Harvard boating men hosted a dinner at the Parker House for the Union members to thank them for their generosity. And thus a warm relationship between Harvard and Union began and continues today. Soon after this race, the Volant Club merged with Union. Here we see Robert Clark of the Volant crew and then a new Union member. In 1860, Union rented, then purchased this boat shed. It was first located at the original Brahmins Bath site, a few blocks from the current club, Union Clubhouse. But Phil had rendered the site high and dry, so it was moved to the newly developed foot of Chestnut Street. In 1864, the new Union 8-oared barge was purchased from a New York builder, Darling. It was double-seated so guests could accompany the members. It was painted white with blue stripes. The stern is on display in the Union Clubhouse. It's used for many excursions all around the Boston waterways and more distant destinations. It served its members for many fine day and evening outings. Here we see a print of a similar barge party on the Schuylkill. Perhaps it's a UBC. In this print, we see an example of an evening excursion on the Hudson, maybe New York AC. In 1870, Union outgrew their boat shed, removed the old one, and built a new magnificent boathouse. The start-finish line was in front of the boathouse. You'll notice that there is a rooftop grandstand for members and guests to watch the races, and the poles were used to spread an awning. From the time of Union's inception, the club offices recognized the importance of keeping professionalism at arm's length from club activities. In 1856, Union organized the Charles River Amateur Boat Club Association to promote amateur rowing. The four clubs were the Triton Club, Young America, the Volant Club, and Union. It only lasted a few years because the other clubs disbanded. In Boston in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, big-time professional rowing and gambling grew, but Union stayed clean from the pitfalls of pro rowing. Union, along with the clubs from New York, Philadelphia, and other areas, recognized that action needed to be taken to preserve amateur rowing. In 1872, they called a meeting of all amateur clubs to form a National Amateur Association. Union's president, Henry B. Rice, was a founding delegate. The National Association of Amateur Oarsmen was formed. This is the heading for the 1899 championship on the Charles. Notice the upper left image shows the new Harvard Bridge. The upper right shows spectators on the wall, and the lower image shows crews heading to the finish in front of the Union Club. And this shows the race, finish, and spectators right in front of the Union Boathouse. Mm-hmm. And a photo of the wall about, here is the view of the Union from that rooftop grandstand. And a photo of the wall about 1900. The city approved plans to build a dam at the riverfront park. The Charles River Dam was completed in 1908. Now the Charles had a constant height. In the background is the construction of the new Esplanade Park. The new boathouse is completed in July 1909 and opening day. And the first row. The 1910 new clubhouse, 144 Chestnut Street, on the site of the 1870 boathouse. Its major activity now is squash. And the clubhouse today with the UBC flag flying high. So Union went from 12 members in 1851 in rented space in a bathhouse to a new boathouse in 1870 at the foot of Chestnut Street with 150 members. Two new buildings in 1910, and today Union has over 700 members. So the annual Union Boat Club versus University Barge Club matches. This is a new book, The Illustrated History of Union Boat Club. It contains 2 pages about the UBC history, and the following images here is in this excerpt. And I'll read it. Amid the wartime racing drought in 1946, member Russell Codman came up with the idea for a regatta to spark fresh competition while showcasing one of the city's most exciting rivalries, Union Boat Club of Boston versus University Barge Club of Philadelphia. By the way, Russell Codman was a member of both Union and the University Boat Clubs. I'll continue. Both UBCs are based in the historic rowing centers of the United States, Boston with its Charles River and Philadelphia on the Schuylkill. Both clubs have strong connections. University was founded in 1854 by 10 University of Pennsylvania students and served as Penn's rowing program, while Union Boat Club started out with a strong Harvard connection. The Boston Globe headline shows match races tomorrow. This is the first match with Union and UBC. The UBC photo is a head-to-head or dual race. Both clubs compete in a series of races in different boat classes. The winner is the team with the most victories at the end of the day. The Boston Globe article the day after with the results. We won't go into the detail who won. The 1974 race board brings back memories showing the names of the participants like Crosby, Connors, and Philippi from Union, and Pattison and Pickering and Thomas from Union University. The high point of the day was the octopede race, relics of the past. They leaked badly, and the real race was to cross the finish line and dart back to the dock before sinking. And here's the 1974 gang in Boston. So thank you for listening. And I'll turn it back over to
Great. Thank you, Bill. That was great.
you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Claudia and John, did you have anything to add about the UBC portion of that?
John, you're on mute.
We did test this.
There we go. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, we had a lot of reports in our newsletter about the races, and the races, the reporting on the races really had a lot more to do with having a lot of fun and some inside jokes at the expense of the competitors, and the attempted skullduggery on both sides. These races were they were mainly for fun, and I know I enjoyed them immensely. The camaraderie between the clubs traveling back and forth. I know when the union folks back in the early days, when they would come to Philadelphia, a lot of the union members would stay at university at Barge Club members' homes. And I had that pleasure a number of times, and it was really great getting to know some of the union guys up close and personal. And anyway, it was a great tradition. And I'm happy that it continues to this day, and hope that it will continue for many more years. Bill, would you any thoughts?
No, basically, I lived in the boathouse and was participating in those in the 70s. And then in 1983, I left to start a family, buy a house, and get on with my life. So I had very little contact with the activities after 1983. So you guys have covered some of that. And so I can only stick with the 1970s.
Yeah, well, it was definitely an event that our club looked forward to with great relish every year. And there are a lot of great parties, and sometimes some even really good rowing.
Well, it is interesting that this competitive event has come about, being that these clubs were very socially oriented through the years. But it seemed like it was a good mix for both clubs. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Folks can unmute themselves if they like, and just go ahead and ask questions. I just would like to thank both Claudia and Bill for presenting tonight, and John for all his contributions as well. Great presentations. And I think, Claudia had said it best when she said it really does take a village. She particularly noted a lot of great leaders that the club university has had throughout the years, and enabled it to survive. I mean, there's not many things that have survived that length of time and those challenges. Highs and lows were reported on honestly, Claudia, and I think that's always great to see. And I think it's very evident that that we owe so much to the army of people that have dedicated their talents to keeping these boat clubs running and growing, and really are just reminders that we are stewards of these buildings and these clubs, and that we're keeping them running for future generations.
Rick Stellick, a couple of comments. That book that Bill showed, 60 Years of the Union Boat Club. If anybody can find a copy, I found one on eBay, I think it was. Get it. It reads like a novel. It has got so much information in there and so many stories about the founding of the club and the inner workings of the club. It's fascinating. And so I urge everybody, if you can ever get a copy of it, to read it, because it's, I've read all the minutes for my club, Malta Boat Club, over the years. And it's amazing the parallels between the information in that book and the clubs along Boathouse Row. The same kind of back and forth, arguing about, what our uniforms look like, the shape of the oars, the painting of the oars. The same things were going on, financial problems, all the things are going on, throwing people out for drunkenness. It's a great story. And the other thing I would mention, you can see behind Jen's screen there, if you look at UBC Boston, look at the ramps to go down before they built their dam at low tide, I guess it was, Bill, and you can comment on that. I don't know how anybody would carry boats in and out of there every day. You had to have pretty strong legs to do that. But the parallel between UBC Philadelphia and UBC Boston, we both eventually had dams, which created pools of water, which is so critical to our operations today. Without those pools of water, Philadelphia Boathouse Row probably never would have existed in the form we have it today. And it sounds like, Bill, you can comment, the same thing in Boston. Without that pool of water, the head of the Charles Regatta probably never would have happened. And Charles would never be the environment it is today for your club. So I think the geography lesson you gave us was very important, Bill, to show how Boston expanded and influenced the formation of your club, and eventually created a pool of water that you could have a stable environment, much like in Philadelphia.
Right. It really affected, the boathouse, because the land was being reclaimed literally right in front of the rowing. So that in 1910, they had to build a whole new boathouse on the waterfront, and then converted the old site to a really beautiful brick clubhouse with a lot of amenities in that. So the point that I was trying to make is that in the 19th century, there were a lot of dynamic things happening in Boston, both geographically as well as the professionals were taking over, then dying out, and then amateurism took over, and so on. So the 19th century was a pretty interesting time in the history of the Union Boat Club.
I noticed, Bill, you mentioned Fred Plaisted in your presentation, near and dear to the hearts of Philadelphia, because he eventually became a Philadelphia fixture for many, many years, and was one of the last professional living oarsmen around. Quite a colorful character.
And for a long time, there was a Plaisted Hall.
Yes.
At the foot of Boathouse Row, on the east side of Boathouse Row. I see some people have hands up.
Yes. Larry, since you're unmuted, why don't you go ahead and go first?
I had my union story dates back to '79. When I spent a few months up in Boston, I was doing some research during med school up there, and living in Beacon Hill. And I was in the middle of my racing attempted racing career with Alfio, and Union was just unbelievably welcoming. Charlie Osborne sponsored me. Charlie and I trained almost every day. I had open access to the boat club as well as to the big brick building across the highway. And I lived in a boarding room 2 blocks from that. So I was basically, for 3 months, it was like nothing ever happened to my training schedule. And everybody was so wonderful. And I've always remembered it. We were in Boston 2 weeks ago. And of course, I had to walk along the Charles with Donna, and somebody had a bay door open. I had to run over and peek in. And I showed Donna, the building, the brick building. Somebody had a Peloton that they were training on. And it brought back all those wonderful memories of how great everybody was to me. And and I'll never forget it. So it just shows you how we can take care of one another in these two wonderful cities we row in. That was my my union story.
That's great, Larry. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to go to Tom Wheel and then John Leonard after that.
Well, thanks, Jen. I want to echo appreciation for two great presentations. It was just fantastic to hear those histories and throw out a challenge for sort of a classic rowing history black hole. If both clubs had adequate documentation of all the regattas that their people had entered, it'd be fascinating to know how many UBC battles there were for Olympic trials or national competitions or head of the Schuylkill, head of the Charles, whatever. And I offer that up to someone who wants to prepare the next speech.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. John Leonard.
So a couple things to mention. So first I'll say that Bill Miller was my coach when I rowed at Boston University. So I'm not sure how many other coachees are here from Bill, but thanks for all the great lessons back in the day, Bill. And just want to pass along a hello from Bill Juergens. I was talking to him. We work on the Dad Vale board together. And he shared an article with me that you wrote about the 1974 World Championship and the whole, whatever the name of that, people that you won. Pretty interesting story. I can share a link for that later with the group that Jen maybe could share around. Just a little fun note, because you mentioned Fred Plaisted. My dad used to claim that he sat on Fred Plaisted's lap when he was a kid. So that was just for the fun. And I also want to thank both speakers. Did a great job of really entertaining to listen to the whole thing tonight. So thanks everybody for that. Thank
you, John. Bill, did you want to?
I was just thinking of.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and John, I think, and we'll talk some more about this, but looking through the history of, and Bill and Tom can talk about Undine Boat Club around 1870. There must have been about 10 different clubs, and Bill Miller referred to one named Undine. I think Harvard had a club called Undine, and it was a very common name around that period of time. Of course, now there's only one that I know of, but Undine Boat Club was around the 1870s, was a very well used name for boat clubs, and all disappeared except yours, John, and of course in Philadelphia, which we're very proud of.
Yeah, it was neat for me to see. I've never seen Undine, the name, in anything else besides Undine stuff. So, you guys out edge us by a few years in each case. We're 1856, and I guess we're a UBC as well, if you want to look at it that way. But, so I guess some of our name must have come from that to some degree. I mean, someone that wrote at Undine must have gotten their link back there.
Well, of course, Undine is a water spirit.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
German water spirit.
Yeah. What's interesting also is the Nigerian word for water is indem. So, and when I had a Nigerian friend in graduate school, I thought, oh my goodness, somehow the water spirit is everywhere. It's on every continent, in every language.
We have a question in the chat room from Brian. Any idea around the use of the terms Barge Club being more common in Philly and Boat Club in Boston?
Well, I could get some perspective. Around 1860, most of the clubs in Philadelphia, and Bill, you can comment on Boston, were referred to as barge clubs. Malta Boat Club was founded as Malta Barge Club, and University Barge Club. So it was very common, but with the advent of racing shells, as we know them today, barges disappeared, and so everybody changed their name to boat clubs. Bill, do you have any perspective on that?
Not necessarily, but I think that it's the function of what the activity was.
Yeah.
I think in Philadelphia, you enjoyed rowing socially in going up river and doing social activities and excursions. And Union started off that way as well. There was no racing going on the first few years, and it was just taking excursions. They didn't have a barge, like an 8-oared barge, until in the late 1860s, I think it was. And so it's just a matter of, they were boating in Boston, where I think in Philadelphia you were having more social outings in barges. So that's what I assume, anyways. nothing that I've seen written that way.
Excuse me, Undine has a copy of that picture of the six that you identified as a Harvard crew. We actually have a copy of that hanging on our wall.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Photograph?
we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm always curious. In fact, I always pointed out to people that once upon a time there were sixes, but can you give a little light as to why sixes disappeared?
And Tom Wheel certainly can comment on that, I believe, because Yale rode sixes as Harvard did. And it was just something that they chose, and they were coxless sixes. But the difficulty was, they started having championships, collegiate championships starting in 1871. And so you would line some of these boats up, and of course you had a freshman crew. Can you imagine a freshman straight six, no coxswain, side-by-side race? I mean, it's difficult enough with coxswains, but they kept on crashing into each other or fouling. And I think that somebody finally said, hey, listen, the English row eights all the time. They've been rowing eights since the 1830s and with coxswains. And so somebody kind of, the light bulb went off. This is what we should be doing.
I think it was the insurance guy that said to do that, so there's less crashes.
Well said, John.
It had to have been unmanageable. There were instances of fouling in these races, so they couldn't control them very easily.
Thank you for that explanation. That'll fill in a hole on my tours of Undine that I give to people. So, because I come to that picture and I say, and plus I didn't know it was a Harvard boat. I had no idea. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody from University Barge Club remember Ned Thomas?
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And his good friend Coleman Boylan.
Oh, the whole bunch of them. That's a whole nother tale.
Yeah.
My tale is
That's another story.
That's another story. Yeah. Ned Thomas was very generous in 1972. A bunch of us who were ignominiously dropped from the national training camp up in Hanover ended up at Union Boat Club, and they received us very generously, and we trained for the Olympic trials there. And just to name drop, our coach was Steve Gladstone. And it was an extraordinary summer racing out of Union, sleeping in Ned Thomas's mother's house, I think it was, on Beacon Hill, and training like hell under Steve Gladstone. So there's my little Union story and name dropping Steve Gladstone. Thank you.
Nice job.
And Ned was a member of, I think, of both clubs, Union and University.
Oh.
Yeah, for years, Ned was the moderator or the announcer at the head of the Schuylkill Regatta.
Right.
And he'd be up on the above the wall there at the finish line as the crews came by, giving a running commentary of the crews and who was in them. And he always had a great side comment about them, a colorful story. Sometimes it was almost too colorful, but Ned was a great guy. He was a lot of fun.
He was tremendous. I used to go out in a quad with Ned, Ace Forey, and David Rawl. And Ned would narrate throughout the row as we would pass different landmarks on the river. So for instance, if we passed the Grant statue, he would say, "There is our general," and it was just totally entertaining. He was a marvelous person.
And Claudia, I noticed in the one picture you had there of the octopede rowing, and correct me if I get these names, Dave was in there, but he was, at that point, he had lost his sight.
Yes.
And he, for many years, rowed a double, and I guess in that octopede also sightless, but he rowed by feel.
Yes, he rowed by feel, and he often rowed with Ace Bory.
Right.
And there was a certain point when Ace had an eye injury. And of course, David was completely blind. And someone said to them, "Well, how did you all do on the water?" And Ace said, "Look, I still got one good eye."
Well, actually, Ace had a complaint after that race because they were assessed a course violation. And so Ace's comment, "You're telling me you gave a course violation to the one-eyed double?"
That's great. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap tonight?
Just want to thank everybody for a wonderful session.
Thanks, Jen.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you to everyone. I did just
Yeah.
want to, before we wrap, just to highlight that we, out of our February story hour, we have been working very hard to begin the effort of preserving and archiving the sports history and kind of getting an organized effort together to establish a collective type of archive. So we've been working hard here in Philadelphia while at the same time working with counterparts across the country. And basically it's just to the goal was to preserve rowing materials in private collections and make them accessible to the rowing community and the public. And we put out a call to action to counterparts across the country and just folks local here in the Philadelphia area. And we did put it out to the local news outlets. I think Ellen mentioned today that it is in the Rowing magazine this month. And just pass the word along if you know of anyone that has rowing memorabilia and don't know what to do with it. We're putting together kind of a quick and dirty one page, what to do if you have something that needs to be preserved. So get in contact with us, and our folks in our committee have been are just really knowledgeable and really passionate about this, and we're going to do everything we can to save as much rowing records as we can. So
Jen,
again, yes.
I just want to add that there is a goal when all of this information is digitized and gathered, and hopefully there will be a virtual start out with a virtual rowing museum. So all of this information and all of these incredible stories and this incredible history will be made available for the general public, the rowing community, and for the future.
Great. So sincere thank you to Bill, Claudia, and John for sharing their knowledge and experience with us. And also my sincere appreciation to our Committee 50 members who work so hard. We meet every Friday. The stories are amazing and we have a great time, but they put in a lot of work to fulfill this initiative. So my many thanks to them. Mark your calendars. HOSR is October 28th and 29th. Registration is open. Deadline is October 8th for standard registration. Come row, come volunteer. We'd love to have you here and host you on the Schuylkill River. Thoughts are always welcome. info@hosr.org. We'll send a follow-up email once I get this up and running on our YouTube page. And if anybody wants to stay on a few extra moments, I know Stephen from the Detroit Boat Club is here with us tonight, and they have something going on there that maybe some folks here have connections that they might want to talk to them about. So Stephen, if you want to hold on, if anybody else does as well, I'm going to let everyone else go, and we hope that we will see you in our next story hour. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.